Thank you to Hong Kong University and the Equality Rights Project and Amica for inviting me to be here today to introduce my book. I hope you can all see the slides, and I hope you also like the cover of my book. I particularly think it speaks to a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about today in this work that seemed to have taken me about 15 years to research and to write. But essentially what I'm going to be doing today is giving you a tour of some of the key ideas that have informed my book. I'm going to be doing it in a chronological way. So we're going to have a whistle-stop tour of the history of contemporary China and attitudes to disability. But I think one of the first things I want to talk about today is that over the past 30 or 40 years that the West has really been engaging in understanding disability and developing disability theory, is that we've learned that words matter a lot. As long as we've had a history of words, and this isn't just the West, this is everywhere, words have been used to stereotype and stigmatise people who fall outside of what broader society calls the norm, the normal. We also know that words in more recent times have been used to empower and enable people, particularly those people who fall outside society's norms. What we are beginning to understand is that the way in which disability is understood, talked about, and experienced is not the same across time or across different cultures. The notion of a global disability culture or a universal disability culture, however tempting it might be to imagine, is now being challenged by academics, activists, and individuals from around the world. While the forces of globalization are working to create lots of connections and forge common goals, particularly in the areas of disability rights, it is clear that historical traditions and cultural expressions, group experiences, individual experiences, and the languages and words we use to describe and tell everybody about these understandings differ very widely. Not only that, we are beginning to see how these differences are not just national differences. They may also differ based on ethnicity, gender, religion, age, and a whole host of other factors that interact to create local and personal experiences and responses to disability. For me, understanding the ways in which such knowledge about disability is produced and communicated and received and understood in a specific cultural context is key to understanding unknown cultures of disability or ignored cultures of disability. It also helps us to understand how different and complex disability is around the world today. So my talk today is obviously going to be using China's recent social and cultural history to illustrate why we need to explore these complexities in more detail. I'll also explain why, drawing on China's specific experience, I have developed this term para-citizenship, and apologies to the interpreter because I don't know how you're going to translate that into Chinese, but I hope you found a good way. I haven't found one yet. But anyway, para-citizenship is the term that I've chosen to use to describe what I see as a very dynamic, but sometimes ambiguous and often very contentious relationship between disabled people and the broader discourses of belonging to which they have to be accommodated. It can help us to explain why these discourses of belonging define the ways in which disabled people are perceived and treated by broader society. But also it can help us to explain or let us see how disabled people themselves see themselves, and also how they define themselves and redefine the worlds around them. But first, I want to take a little detour and talk to you about China's Kingdom of the Little People, 小矮人王国. And why it illustrates for me so well the predicament of disabled people when it comes to national and local discourses of belonging. And of course, we're talking about China here. The Kingdom of the Little People was founded in 2009 by a real estate mogul, Chen Mingjing. According to the reports, he did so because, and I quote, he pitied their situation. He said, their families despised them, cursed them, so they had to sleep on the street. I thought we should build a little kingdom for them. Well, this is a self-contained world. It's literally a kingdom. The 100 or so inhabitants of the park work within the park, but live in a dorm next door where everything is built to be as accessible as possible for them. Here, the boundaries of citizenship are strict. All of the inhabitants have to be less than 130 centimetres tall. The inhabitants quite literally perform citizenship. They sing, dance, perform tricks on the stage for the visitors. They also pretend to live in little mushroom-like houses when the park is open. The kingdom has been critiqued by disability rights theorists and activists around the world. They argue that such a kingdom isolates disabled people and is highly reminiscent of the 19th century freak shows of the US and the UK elsewhere. The staff perform for non-disabled guests who point and giggle at their disability. It reassures these non-disabled audiences of their physical superiority. In some, the critics argue, it does more to reinforce stigmatization than dismantle it. But when interviewed, the park staff have said that they are grateful for the opportunity to work, gain self-respect, and be productive members of society. They come, they say, to escape the infantilization, that means being treated like children, and discrimination of the world outside. Not all of them are destitute when they arrive. Some are fully qualified doctors. Others are professionals who have been able to find work because of their short stature. Some say that they also prefer to live with people who are, and in their words, like them. They are less lonely than if they were living in the normal world. Many have found love, marriage, and children. Clearly, there is a tension, therefore, between what disability theory tells us is acceptable or not, and how disabled people should understand their experiences according to that theory, and what is actually happening in practice and under very real circumstances in China. And herein lies my dilemma, our dilemma. I think we're at an important juncture where we need to address the fundamental problem caused by applying universal theories, which may have been developed in Western or Anglophone contexts, also known as the global North, directly to China or other societies. As my own research and others have shown, such theories often based on very specific socio-political contexts and often foregrounds contemporary ideals, and I put emphasis on the word ideals. These are things that we're aiming for, not actually necessarily in practice, to challenge actual circumstances in those socio-political contexts. As a result, if we apply them directly to other contexts, the findings will show non-global North contexts in an even more negative light than would be found in the global North. But the problem might be deeper than this. It means that nuances, even glaring differences in other contexts are overlooked, or even worse, explained away as exceptionalism, i.e. there's something different about that country. It fails to recognise the sometimes violent processes of colonialism, post-colonialism. I'm thinking of war, labour, exploitation, pollution, policy-making, ideology, that are the cause of many impairments or disabling attitudes more broadly in these other contexts. Equally importantly, it fails to recognise the voices of the majority disabled world. And it is important to note that the vast majority of disabled people live outside the global North. In these contexts, many people are making their own choices based on their own needs and desires, living lives that they and their communities perceive to be fulfilling and of value. So, while disability is a global phenomenon, this does not mean to say that there is a uniformity to the way in which disability is understood or experienced around the world. Now, disability studies in the United Kingdom has, since the 1970s, become dominated by what is known as the social model and its notion of a disabling society. It was developed to challenge the then dominant medical discourse, or the medical model, which meant that individuals and their impairments were seen as society's problem. The social model has tried to turn the tables so that the focus is on society and the barriers to full and equal participation in society, regardless of whatever the impairment is or its severity. Research has shown that even these concepts and theories that have been so useful in helping us to understand disability in the global north may not necessarily be the dominant understandings of those working in regions there. And even countries within the global north reveal sometimes quite different interpretations and explanations. The United States, for example, uses a different approach and explains disability according to a minority model. It focuses on an ableist society, its cultural norms and assumptions of the normal to create exclusion and prejudice. So we have these various models of disability that have been used to explain what is going on. But as I say, from my UK perspective, the two are the medical model and the social model have been most significant of recent time. But of course, as I said before, we cannot ignore globalization and the ways in which new media, new forms of communication and changes in policy making made changes to the ways in which disability is understood around the world. We have to remember that these changes are relatively recent phenomena and that certain societies have been quicker to adopt and embrace them than others. Traditional local understandings may be more resistant to change depending on a society's openness to such changes and innovations. And on the screen, you'll see a quote from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this has been one of the most far-reaching and fundamental attempts to change global attitudes and approaches. It was adopted on the 13th of December in 2006 and entered into force on the 3rd of May in 2008. It takes an intentionally broad categorization of disabled people in order to assure that people with all types of impairments are able to enjoy fundamental freedoms and human rights. In doing so, it attempts to move global understandings towards viewing disabled people as subjects with rights, people who are capable of claiming those rights and making decisions for their lives based on their free and uninformed consent, as well as being active members of society, and away from the medical view that they should be viewed as objects of medical treatment, social protection and charity. And they do this through various ways, to combat stereotypes and to promote the awareness of capacities of disabled people. The sheer ubiquity, so that means the spread of the CRPD in political, academic and institutional discourses of disability today, however, means it is all too easy to assume that there is a common global vision of disability. Yet, while activists and disabled people from around the world and policymakers are increasing conversations about what this means and how to implement the aims and objectives of the CRPD, and China is obviously included here, having signed up in 2008, these contacts are revealing wide gaps in assumptions about what this might actually mean in practice. What we do know, however, is that possibly more than any other group, disabled people, wherever they may be around the world, are more likely to be denied what might be thought of as full citizenship in their respective communities. They have, by scholars, been described as the semi-citizens, the shadow citizens, or the absent citizens. And this has been shown to occur across all five major realms of citizenship: civic citizenship, political, economic, social, and cultural. For American scholars, Snyder and Mitchell, this is called able nationalism, the idea that nations have developed the template of an ideal citizen that is characterized by able-bodiedness, able-mindedness, and normalcy. The perceived distance of the disabled body from the norms of able-bodied citizenship has only encouraged and validated the long-held medical view of disability, where prevention or cure is seen as the only way to rescue people from their own personal tragedy and return them to a normal state of being. But these conceptions of disability and citizenship, and I think the image is a really interesting one because it does sort of reveal the shadowy nature that some people consider disabled citizenship to be. For me, they often posit disabled people as less than full citizens, and it can only go so far. They generally overlook the instability of impairment that people can come in and out of disability, the agency of disabled people themselves, the choices that they can make, the dynamism or the changing fluid nature of norms and ideals of citizenship, and the highly effective nature of discourses of belonging, meaning that actually sometimes, even though they might feel to be not inclusive, people do find a sense of belonging and inclusion in those discourses. And this is where I think my study of disability in China has something to offer. So I'm going to take you on that whistle-stop tour through recent Chinese history to explain what I mean and talk about how I think the good disabled citizen has been created in China over time. And certainly if you go back in Chinese history, right back to the earliest times of antiquity, we can see in a strong sense of paternalistic benevolence, in those texts. And I'm thinking if we go back to the Book of Rites, the Li Ji, one of the 5 Confucian classics, Confucius himself has often talked about the times when rulers would ensure that everybody who was in need, widows, orphans, those who were crippled or sick, would be looked after, and that they would be supported according to what they could give back to society, which suggests that benefits, even in this early day, came with some sort of responsibilities too. In subsequent, later official and semi-official records, beggars and other marginal and displaced figures with no clear social place or identity, many of whom were disabled, were commonly treated with scorn and suspicion. By the mid-14th century, in the Ming Dynasty, such people were labelled as mean or base people, jianmin. These were in opposition or in contrast to ordinary commoners, liangmin. These were the good people. They were viewed as outsiders, always dangerous and sometimes challenging to social systems and political orders. One such vision of this world is from the Ming Dynasty. It's Zhou Chen's 1516 album of 24 figures. Today it's contained in the Honolulu Museum of Art. Here, Zhou Chen's art reveals the otherness or emphasizes the otherness of these socially marginalized people. They inhabit the borders of the Confucian civilized world. It's not really surprising that these images come to us from this period. Famine, natural disasters, expanding urbanization, population growth, conflict, all of which characterized the late years of the Ming Dynasty, would have increased the visibility and number of beggars, social outcasts, and disabled people during the artist's lifetime. But it was also during this time that we see the appearance of more systematic establishment of support for disabled people and welfare. We see relief homes supported by the government for those who were considered to be vulnerable. Yet, while empathy and compassion for those less fortunate formed a fundamental element of Confucian thinking and shaped community, family, and individual responses to disability, Confucianism's focus on the importance of a whole and able body and mind also resulted in lots of long-lasting and negative influences on both popular and governmental attitudes towards physical and mental non-normativity. We know that the literal body itself was supposed to be respected and protected. It was bequeathed by parents and obligated to provide for them. Through active participation in family, clan, ritual life, procreation, bearing children, the body showed that it was filial. It gave it meaning. If one did not fulfill these obligations, you could be perceived as being unfilial and a threat to the lineage or the local economy. But the body was also conceived in Confucian thinking as a public manifestation of self-cultivation. Here, imperfection inferred clumsiness, vulgarity, a lack of cultivation, which in turn reinforced even further the undesirability of physical or mental impairment. Socially dominant Confucianism would have an impact as China moved into the late 19th century and 20th century. Here, new ideas about the body, from biomedicine, the rise of global sports, and later on, as we'll see in a minute, socialist revolution, would all find a ready, homegrown philosophy that valorized or prized the whole and able body. As these ideas came together, it was the physical strength of the able and active body that would become a central part of new discourses of citizenship. China's humiliation at the hands of foreign powers had led to the widespread use of the term Dongya Bingfu, the sick man of Asia. The term was used to pathologize Chinese cultural identity, and photographic images and paintings of Chinese subjects with a whole range of impairments and illnesses circulated around to evidence that. The paintings here that I've put on the slide here were commissioned by medical missionary Peter Parker in Canton in the mid-19th century. They provide an insight into this world. Many of the paintings produced by his assistant Lam Qua, who was there at the time, like the ones here, revealing women with breast tumours and goiters and tumours extending from the rear, sort of revealing the female human body in particular to the gendered and colonial gaze of the white male doctors who sought to seek out difference in China. I'm going to return to this idea about the exposure of women's bodies later, because I think there's a very big gendered element to this. But Western missionaries also played their part. They established many of the earliest schools for disabled children. Here we have some pictures from the boys' blind school in Fuzhou, set up by an Australian missionary, Amy Ann Oxley Wilkinson, in 1898, which provided a route to both know God and learn skills for survival. At the same time, principles of sociology and images of the nation as a biological organism stimulated discussions of social Darwinism in Chinese. The Chinese elites started to begin to reimagine the nation as a body. And under the careful guidance of Liang Qichao, the search for a Xinmin, a new or renovated people, began. They were to liberate the Chinese body and minds from the shackle of the past and strengthen it to ensure a prosperous future for the nation. Women's bodies in particular became the places for the birth of this new nation. Efforts became focused on promotion of healthy bodies, healthy marriages, healthy births to ensure an excellent race, 优秀种族, and a robust citizenry, 坚传人. With physical normality, the new prerequisite, imported notions of eugenics found a ready audience eager to apply Western scientific knowledge to the medical deficiencies of China. The Chinese notion of 素质, human quality or human capital, also emerged at this time as a result of these many interweaving discourses and worked to marginalize and stigmatize the impaired body even further. The connection between the normative mind and body, the ideal citizen, and even personhood itself became thoroughly cemented. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, the New Life movement, 新生活运动, and the nationalist government sought to purge unhealthy habits by a comprehensive program of hygiene and morality, highlighting the way in which China's salvation was seen to be inextricably linked to a new Chinese citizen who was healthy and rigorous in body and spirit. The new Chinese citizens would need to be responsible and responsive to these new physical and moral requirements. And disabled people were not exempt at all. As we see here from this quote by Xu Qincheng, who was writing in 1922, people with impairments would be considered potential citizens of the Republic and would be offered the opportunity to participate more fully in its life through the development of skills in self-sufficiency. And you see this term a lot, 自食其力, that they can fend for themselves. So people would have to be taught to be able to support themselves. Citizenship was going to be a very active rather than a passive thing, and one in which people with physical and mental impairment could participate given the right education by the state and given appropriate nurturing and effort on behalf of the citizen. This was the way that disabled people, the Feiren, as they were known at the time, could become self-reliant and useful. But this move to the ideal, useful citizen was not just a nationalist endeavour. As early as 1917, in his article, A Study of Physical Culture, 体育之研究, Mao Zedong had begun to conceptualise the ways in which the body was linked to human will. Mao linked the training of the body with the strength of a nation in a new way, through the notion of continuous revolution, which was to be carried out by an active body on behalf of a nation that was forever in motion. Health was paramount for both nationalists and communists. The fitness of the physical body became linked to the fitness of the body politic. Regardless, therefore, of the potential for disabled people to attain full citizenship, other contradictory discourses worked to diminish this in reality, particularly for those who were unable to fulfill this active bodily function. It was going to be proving extremely difficult to disentangle these long-held understandings that disabled people were somehow less worthy or capable than non-disabled people. But this didn't mean to say that voices from within disabled communities in China were not silent on this. The phrase disabled but not useless, 差而不废, which became quite prevalent in the 1980s, had already been appearing in newspapers such as Renmin Ribao, People's Daily, from the early 1950s onwards. Although we cannot be sure of its true origins, the use of the phrase suggests that it was already being used to reinforce new understandings of disability. It reflects an understanding that becoming a useful person to the revolution, and therefore the country, was a process, and the responsibility for doing so laid with the disabled person themselves, provided they were given the tools and opportunities to do so. As we can see here in the example of Yu Kedong, who had lost both arms in a mining accident in 1956, we can see how this was understood by individuals at the time. Of his own experience, Yu writes that he describes himself as a Tan Fei Ren, and I'm just going to put that on there, Tan Fei Ren. I'm a Tan Fei Ren who lost both arms. He was seriously injured, but the party gave me a set of prosthetic hands. I was able to go back to work. The kindness of the party is higher than the mountains. I am determined to become a person who is disabled but not useless, 三而不废, and to devote everything I can to the party's work. While a set of prosthetic hands enabled Yu Kedong to return to work, it is clear that this new emphasis on productive citizens did nothing to challenge the primacy of a strong and healthy able body. Its concern with restoring his body to the whole state it had before. But what it did do was demonstrate to a Chinese audience that a body did not necessarily have to be inherently strong to be transformed into a powerful revolutionary machine. The old society, where disabled people were oppressed and viewed as rubbish, 废物, and described as good-for-nothings or useless beings, 废人, had been replaced by a new society that offered them the same rights as everyone else, and an environment where they were disabled but not useless, 残而不废, and able to defend for themselves, 自食其力. In this new society, both disabled and non-disabled people were shown to have been transformed through a newfound sense of social solidarity and comradeship and a new people. Supported by the community, disabled people felt that they could flourish and become valued members of the community as long as they demonstrated that they were broken in body but not in mind. 身残心不废. Here we can see that wounded veterans and disabled people more broadly could be transformed from the weak into the propaganda that was strong. A spirit of selflessness and service to the revolution and the party and determination to overcome physical and mental difficulties, whether through sheer will or rehabilitation and cure, were offered as desirable qualities and, more significantly, achievable objectives by the various arms of the state propaganda machine. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with the tale of the miraculous curing of 115 deaf children in Liaoning, as reported in this propaganda film from 1969. It was a tale that was told in many different formats during the Cultural Revolution. The numbers of the children, the locations where it happened, and sometimes even the impairments just changed each time. It was, of course, highly unlikely to have happened, but that really wasn't the point. The point was that disabled children, once cured of their impairment, could be seen to be fully able to participate in the triumph of Mao's ongoing revolution alongside their non-disabled peers. By the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976 and the beginnings of the Reform era, ushered in several changes that would see disabled people moving into an even more prominent role in China's search for its place in the world and a new citizen ready to take it there. I am sure many of you will recognise Zhang Haidi, possibly China's most famous disabled person and current chair of the China Disabled Persons Federation, 中国残联. This is the organisation responsibility for disability work in China since 1988. In 1981, she rose to prominence as one of a raft of new model citizens, in her case for young people. An illness early in life had left her paralysed. Despite this, the news reports tell us she was able to overcome her disability to become a productive member of the new society. She had learned several languages, had become a barefoot doctor, and many other things besides. She was, according to reports, broken in body but not in spirit, 身残志坚. She exuded a spirit of tireless self-improvement, 自强不息. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, as I detail in my book, her journey to stardom was not without its difficulties. as officials debated a long time whether she, a disabled woman, could be a model for non-disabled young people. Her intended audience, young people from around China, also queried her suitability. But what mattered, however, in the end, was the core message that someone who was weak could be transformed into something strong. The fact that she was female was also in her favour. Her weak female body could be exposed most intimately to reveal even further weakness that could be turned to a strength. The reports at the time appeared to take delight in telling their audiences of her incontinence, for example, something that I've found to be much less common in stories about disabled men. The new era of Zhang Haidi and her unwavering spirit also ushered in changes to language. Tanji came by around 1983 to replace Tan Fei in official discourses. The dreaded useless character Fei had gone, but in its place a continued emphasis on the medical with Ji. One step forward, but two steps back, perhaps. Nonetheless, this change would see the return, as mentioned before, of the phrase 残而不废, this time shortened for 残疾而不残废, as disabled people celebrated a new label for their broader collective identity. And so, in contrast to the bottom-up development of multiple impairment-based identities that have at times coalesced into broader universal disabled consciousnesses in, for example, the UK, China's discourse of disability has been top-down. The state has a leading role in shaping and giving meaning to disabled lives. In her report to the 6th National Congress of the CDPF, Chair Zhang Haidi highlighted this role that the state has played in improving their lives. So here, under the cordial care and high degree of attention of the Party Central and the State Council, and thanks to the work of Comrade Deng Poufang and generations of disability workers, the undertakings of disabled people took off. The problem with such ideological positioning from the top down is that disabled people in China often continue to be dealt with as one group, with the same personal and social problems, similar aspirations and similar desires. It also is the case that it presents a striking contradiction. A strong degree of passivity, they are under the care of the government, alongside an equally strong degree of activity. We're talking about the undertakings of disabled people here. A disabled citizen's right to care in China continues, it seems, to come with a heavy dose of responsibility. Indeed, this is so much so that it is written into the laws designed to protect them. And here we have some excerpts from the 残疾人保障法, the law on the protection of disabled people, which continues to be the guiding document for disabled people and protection of rights in China today. So it talks about rights and dignity. Yet in Article 2 here, you can see that the description and definition of disability does not reflect the CRPD's intentionally broad descriptor of disability. Here, it talks about somebody who is unable to perform an activity in the way that is considered normal. Essentially, if you have a disability, you are abnormal. But interestingly, from my perspective, also, is the fact that the law particularly articulates this requirement that disabled people should display an optimistic and enterprising spirit. They should have a sense of self-respect, self-confidence, self-improvement and self-reliance, or something I call the four selves, 四者, 自尊, 自信, 自强, 自立. And they need to make contributions to the socialist construction. Now, these four selves appear everywhere in relation to disabled people. Wherever you look, you seem to find it. It's not specifically related to disabled people, but it is in the law, encouraging them, requiring them should do this. And it's everywhere. Here we have it decorating a school, a special education school, to remind the children of their duties under law. Here we have a similar sense. Here we've only got 自尊, 自信, 自强. But here, a reminder that to be a good disabled person, one has to be just like an able-bodied person. Okay, so we have to be like somebody, a member of society. You have to be just like a disabled person. You have to have self-respect, self-belief, and be self-improving. And this is a vocational school for disabled students who are wanting to work in the service industry. And here, even under the Chinese dream, disabled people are encouraged to specifically self-strengthen or self-improve to achieve the Chinese dream. So disabled people then are both legally and emotionally reminded daily of their duties and responsibilities as good disabled citizens. So how are you a good disabled citizen in China? Well, as we've seen, the urgency is to be as normal or the same as a normal or disabled-bodied person, an able-bodied person, a 正常或健全人一样. You do this through cure, rehabilitation, or through the four selves. This is how you're emotionally engaged to be a good disabled person. In doing so, you can then fend for yourself, support yourself, you can be integrated into society, you can then work to repay society and therefore become a useful person and have a life worth living. And these are all phrases that I've found as I've done my research through a wide variety of cultural products in China, produced up to very recently. So many of these understandings of what makes a good disabled person are reproduced by disabled persons themselves in their own public writings. The case of Yin Shujun, for example, and this is her the cover of her own memoir, which was published in 2012, reveals the ways in which her own disablement and struggles to understand how she should be useful to society again, reflect some of these understandings more broadly. She was a woman who was in a road traffic accident, and she lost the use of her legs, and one of which had to be amputated. And she writes her memoir, her diary in her bed, and she tells us about how she sort of comes to terms with her new situation and how she ultimately finds value in her life once again. But her writing is filled with talk of her now not healthy position. She wants to be a normal person once again, but also the emotional side of it. She was suffering pain, helplessness, confusion, but she wanted desperate to repay that, and she does so in the end by engaging in community work and acting as an inspirational model for non-disabled people. Personal writings like Yin Shujun's demonstrate that becoming a good disabled citizen is neither straightforward nor lacking in tremendous physical and emotional effort. But it's not just political and social messages that have carried these understandings to disabled and non-disabled audiences alike. As I show in some of the chapters, cultural sources are equally involved in reinforcing and challenging the discourses of what makes an ideal citizen. In Yan Ke's 2004 book, 收获, Pleasure, we find a rather unusual utopia for disabled people. Now, it's set in a village called Pleasure, 收获, and it had been founded back in the Ming Dynasty, but it had been forgotten by society, forgotten by the world. It was a village outside society. The people, the villagers, all of whom were disabled, appear to lead happy and contented lives. We find a community of almost exclusively disabled characters, blind, deaf, mute, cripples, other physical deficiencies. They lack an arm, a leg, they have dwarfism, etc. Even the dogs in the village are disabled. In contrast to our understanding that disabled people are most often excluded from full citizenship, the expectation in Pleasure is that you have to be disabled or you have to marry a disabled person in order to become a citizen of this desirable place that is Pleasure. To be useless to the outside world defines belonging in Pleasure. The villagers of Pleasure are known as the lackers. Anybody outside Pleasure are the holers. Many of the characters have names which reflect their impairments. The linkages of these animal characteristics to the low position of animals in Confucian society emphasizes the difference between the lackers and the holers. And as the story developed, we hear how the villagers attempted to buy money to join a performance troupe that tours the outside holers' world, where they are cheered and derided in equal measure by the holers who come to stare. And here is a quote from the book. Everyone went crazy. Nobody could believe that there was such an amazing performance troupe, comprising entirely of people who were blind, lame, deaf, paralytic, or mute. People who were missing a limb, who had an extra finger, who were dwarves, less than 3 feet tall. No one could believe they had been all born in the same village. In a manner similar to the performers of the Kingdom of the Little People, the performers from Pleasure reassure the anxious holers of their normalcy. It is only when the inhabitants are returned to Pleasure that outside society goes back to feeling normal again, and the lackers, the disabled people, find a home of safety and community. Equilibrium is restored. So, what I've tried to show today is that understanding culture and history is really important. China, as a particular case study, has enabled me to see the ways in which understandings of and responses to disability are complex and contradictory. Agency, the power for people to decide how they want to be seen and they want to sort of live their lives, can coexist with structures, laws, regulations, guidance determined to prescribe those disabled voices. This is where I believe para-citizenship can play a role. Unlike the negative descriptors of citizenship for disabled people more common in global north theories, shadow citizens, semi-citizens, I would argue that para-citizens and para-citizenship can capture the ways in which disabled people can be isolated and marginalised, viewed as different and not normal, but simultaneously reflect a sense of equality and inclusion side by side that people might feel as they perform the citizenship and be rewarded by state and society for doing so. Using para-citizenship, we can recognise that citizenship for disabled people is precarious and unstable, but it also cover, without judgment, the decisions that people make themselves about whether they engage in these discourses of citizenship. Even though they might not always sound right to approaches that look to sources of oppression, under the social model, for example. Para-citizenship helps to avoid top-down conceptions of citizenship. It opens up the potential for nuance and change, for example, when rights-based policy making comes to the fore, as is happening in China right now. Even the language of disability is changing. We're moving from Canji to Canzheng, for example, which recognises the social barriers that prevent people from engaging fully and participating in social and public and economic life. Para-citizenship recognises all of these things. We can see the rules and structures that shape the social systems and the individuals and groups within them, but recognise also that people make choices, even though sometimes those are constrained. We have to understand this. We have to understand that all of these things play a part. Para-citizenship is a result of many overlapping processes. They are social, they are medical, they are emotional, they are cultural, they are political, they are legal. All of these things play a role, and we have to understand these. So what are the implications then? I would argue that we cannot ignore any of them. The ways in which representations of particular groups produce and reproduce assumptions about them often set up a clear-cut hierarchy of values. Anything that differs from the pinnacle must be regarded as inferior. For China, that pinnacle has and continues to be a subject who is fit, healthy, able-bodied, active and productive. The state demonstrates its paternalism through discourses of para-citizenship. It guides people who don't fit those categories into those something that resembles them as closely as possible. The state educates disabled people in what is deemed to be the attributes and behaviours of an ideal para-citizen. They create processes through which they can engage with the culture of para-citizenship and be rewarded for doing so. The lives of those who have successfully navigated their way from weakness to strength are promoted and provide evidence that the system works. My research also shows, and I've not really been able to talk about it today, but many individuals become locked into this limited set of cultural representations available to them. They perform para-citizenship in the ways and narratives that are given to them because they give their lives value and worth. And what I think this means is threefold. First, using the framework of para-citizenship, we can see the complexity of the process involved in shaping a discourse of belonging. It means that addressing just one element, whether social, emotional, cultural, political, legal, or medical, is insufficient to bring about substantive and meaningful change over the long term. The establishment of a rights-based approach, for example, is hugely important, but without shifts in the way in which those rights are spoken about and written about, here I'm thinking about the laws in which words normal or the encouragement and the behaviours, the four selves, limit its potential. Words matter, as I said at the start, they matter a lot. Stereotypes are pernicious and pervasive. They are easy to create, but very difficult to dismantle. Para-citizenship, number two, also forces us in the West to reconsider our relationship with cultures and experiences which don't fit our ideals of what should be happening, despite the fact that those ideals are rarely met here either. It doesn't stop me to say we shouldn't stop seeking ways to ensure that the aims and ambitions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability aren't met. We need to understand why a rights-based approach might not immediately be meaningful to everyone because of those significant and social cultural difficulties. Education is key. And finally, para-citizenship encourages us to seek out not just the voices of disabled people themselves, which helps us to answer why people sometimes don't understand it or can't engage with those approaches, but also the leadership of disabled people in their own destiny. The reason why much of what I've described today happens is because the dominant voices are coming from the non-disabled community. They have few ways to fully understand or represent disabled lives in a way that is meaningful. They can only approximate. We need to hear and we need to be led by disabled people from all parts of the community, from different ethnicities, of different ages, of different genders, and of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And only then, I believe, that we will find a more humane and equitable path forward for China and for everywhere. Thank you for listening.
So I think my first question is that how does this cultural notion of ideal disabled citizen, particularly those narratives surrounding 生产之间自强不息 evolved by the state since the 1980s, continue to influence other domains of social and political citizenship of people with disability in China today? How do this cultural narrative shape people with disability experience in maybe employment, education, and other realms of community life? My second question is, you also mentioned that since China's ratification of the CRPD in 2008, the global ideas of disability rights also come into China. Maybe one important phenomenon that comes along this trend is the emergence of disabled people's organization and community network, such as maybe the 1+1 1+1 disability group or 少数派, whose members also in our audience today. So when I was reading this book, I also kept wondering how you would make meanings of this community organizing initiative by people with disability. What alternative narrative and imaginary of disability citizenship that they are creating in the context of China?
In terms of your two questions, I think the first one is, how do these ideas that have been sort of circulated, these stereotypes, these encouragements, these phrases, how are they relevant to today, and how do I see them sort of affecting the ways in which people are accessing the full range of opportunities and life experiences? Well, I think a lot. In all honesty, and I'm fortunate to work with many researchers who are looking very specifically at employment rights for disabled persons, social rights, marriage rights, civic rights, political rights. And in all senses, they are seeing that the pervasiveness of these stereotypes and these phrases are often both used by disabled persons themselves in describing their own attitudes, their own behaviours, and their own reasons for engaging and not engaging with particular activities, but also they are seen by them to be used as excuses and criticisms of them to discriminate against them. So, for example, in terms of employment, we see often that disabled people are obviously excluded from many types of employment simply because of their disability. They can't access teaching roles because they have albinism, for example, which of course is no excuse for not being able to become a teacher. They are guided into roles that are seen to be suitable on account of their disability, because that's seen to be the ways in which disabled people are best suited because of their impairment, which of course is a nonsense. And it's all because of the structures of society and the ways in which people talk about disabled people that these things continue to exist. And that happens in social life as well. So, and that's why I say it really is important that even when rights-based approaches come into a country and are there and can be used and mobilized, if society doesn't change around them and education isn't sufficient and awareness raising isn't done in a way that is meaningful and substantive, then the change can't happen, because the attitudes don't change, and attitudes take an awful long time to change. Laws can be changed relatively quickly, but attitudes can't. And so it's really important to understand what the barriers are in particular contexts, and why I say very strongly that I think it's important that we understand particular contexts and how people have come to understand disability and impairment, both from a disabled person's perspective, but also a broader non-disabled discourse perspective. Because only then, if we understand how and why, we can then start to counteract that and challenge that if we see that these attitudes are disabling in the first place. So what I'm saying is we're not moving necessarily away from the aims of the CRPD or the social model. You know, society is disabling. End of. It is. We just have to see how we can, what are the next steps? And it might be the steps for China are different for somewhere else, because the attitudes and the reasons why, how people are classed as disabled changes from country to country. The reasons why impairments are caused have different sources. And, you know, whether it's caused by civil war, whether it's caused by pandemics, you know, all of these things have different causes and have different attitudes attached to them and values. And so understanding that, I think, is really, really important. Your second question then sort of mentions about the CRPD and the role of disabled persons organisations, and you mentioned some fantastic ones such as EJI, who are doing super work. And I think my message for disabled persons organisations are really think about how we can change attitudes. And one of the ways in which I think China has a long way to go is this idea of what's normal and what's not normal. And I think when you have a law that actually articulates disabled people as not normal, I think that is a massive barrier. So how do you then normalise disability? How do you make sure that disability is not seen as something that is abnormal, that is actually part of our human experience? Most of us will become disabled in our lifetime. So why should we treat people with impairments any differently? Why should they be marginalised? Why should be this? And again, it's about education. It's about making disabled people more visible in society, but doing so in a way that they're engaged in occupations that are seen as normal. And what we found in China, or what my research has found, is where disabled people are visible in society and culture, they are doing extraordinary things. They're not even normal disabled people. They are extraordinary disabled people. They are super cripples, is the term that we use in academia. So why aren't there television programs where the TV anchor is a disabled person, a wheelchair user? Why aren't there, more television programs and films where they include disabled characters, but it's not about their disability? So it's about trying to change it. So disability is the second thing that comes along. It's not actually the major reason why disabled people are wheeled out in front of non-disabled audiences. And that changes role models, you know. So why should all disabled people be inspirational? That's impossible to be. Why can't they just live their lives as everybody else can, you know, non-disabled people? So it's about trying to normalise discourses of disability, so we're not always talking about inspirational exceptionality. We're talking about people. And I think once we start to talk about people, then that changes things.
Question number 1, Zhang Yaoyuan from the Southeastern University asking that so you describe your research your research approach, and I think that you might be undertaking the cultural relativism approach that is rooted in local culture, but then it might be something that Edward Stead is critiquing about Orientalism. So how do you see such a criticism? And another important question is that do you have any plans of publishing it in Chinese? I hope to read it as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Zhang Laoshe. That's a really interesting question, and I think it's really important. I mean, one of the as you can tell, what I'm trying to get away from is the sense of Orientalism. Actually, I feel that it's very important that an Orientalist approach doesn't recognize the value of the home culture in creating and disseminating ideals about what should and shouldn't be in its own culture. And of course, I think that's my biggest critique of Western theorists, is that they often look at China and they other it, and they say that it's different and it's exceptional on all of these reasons. And I think what I'm trying to say is not necessarily that China is exceptional. I'm trying to understand, I think it is much better to avoid ethnocentrism and just trying to think of ways in which all of these ideas, regardless of whether it's China or whether it's elsewhere, they may well have common roots, but they may well also have their local roots as well. And I think if you take a blanket brush and apply it immediately to a country, I think that's a real problem, because then people don't understand it. I mean, to take the CLPD, for example, if I spoke to lots of disabled people in England, they would have no idea about the CLPD. They wouldn't understand how it has impacted their lives, and neither would people in China. They may understand about rights, but again, they may well not. They may live their life without the concept of what rights are and important to them. So I understand your question, but I think it's a conversation, and I think it's very difficult that if you talk about a sort of a cultural approach, often people are very unconscious of the bonds of their own culture, and this affects the ways in which they react to the world. And I think cultural relativism forces us to think about strategies and methods that enable us to both see how people are shaped by their own culture, but also how cultures speak to each other more broadly as well. So that would be my answer to that. So thank you for that. I hope that answers your question. In terms of publishing the book, I think, which is your second question, that would be great. So if anybody can think of a Chinese publisher that would like to take on this work, that would be super.
Thank you. So we have another question from Dan Chen Shao. So the question is, hi, Professor Dauncey, thanks for your sharing. I love your book very much. I have one question that it seems the only people with physical disability can overcome the disability is to strengthen their spirit, then finally become ideal citizen. While how about people with intellectual disability? Is there any chance for them?
That is a really, really important question. I think my focus of my book is predominantly on physical impairment, because that's my experience. So I always try to write from my own experiences, and intellectual disabilities and learning impairments is not my speciality. So, but one of the things I do try to reinforce throughout the book is that often what we talk about for the physical body often applies even more so to the mind and intellectual impairments. And you're absolutely right that one of the problems of this discourse that China has in overcoming is that while it's relatively straightforward to get a prosthetic arm or to engage in some sort of, put on a hearing aid or have some surgery to correct vision, and I say relatively, obviously, not everybody can do this, but for people with learning impairments and developmental delay, I think this is where it becomes extremely important that we try to change this discourse, because of course, where is the rehabilitation? Where is the cure for that? The whole discourse has to change so that isn't the way for people to overcome. There should be no overcoming in the first place, is my answer to that. And I think it goes back to the idea about how para-citizenship, we have to understand that there is a medical dimension to disability. We can't ignore it. The social model is important because it highlights the social aspects to impairment and disability. But it's important that we also recognise that everybody has lots of different types of impairment, and not all types of impairment can respond to broader discourses of belonging, particularly when they require effort and they require certain mental capacity or physical effort. All of these things are very highly exclusionary and discriminatory. So is there a chance for them? Well, at the moment, I think it's very difficult. And until this discourse changes, and this isn't just China, this is everywhere. What I didn't talk about today is there is often a hierarchy of disability, and people perceive physical impairment to be somehow a more acceptable disability than a learning impairment because of that ability to overcome, and again I'm talking about the UK here just as much as China, and so it's only as we need to start recognizing that it's humanity, that it's a person, and it's not the impairment that defines the person. And a person's contribution to society doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't have to be economic, it doesn't have to be social. As a society, we need to see that care is also, and relationships are also really important. And once we understand that, I think all of this changes. But until then, I think it's going to be very difficult. Now, I know there are things happening, where people with learning impairments are included, and there are lots of organisations that are working to support people with learning impairments and to provide them with opportunities for work, and that is sustainable. I mean, one of the things that's really has interestingly been a debate in the UK is how much people with learning impairments should be paid versus people with not learning impairments. And there are arguments that they shouldn't be paid as much because they can't be as productive, which I think is an awful message to send, a dreadful message to send. I think, a day's work is a day's work, and people need to be recompensed for their work equally fairly, and because it sets up again this perception that people with learning impairments can't do the same job to the same standard. Of course, there are some jobs that they possibly can't do, but there are lots of jobs that I can't do either. And so I wouldn't expect to do that. So, it's about society changing around disabled people, and it should be disabled people because that is the medical model. It's the disabled person is forced to change themselves to fit society. Let's change society to fit everybody.
So the next question comes from NOBU. If we said that the idea that disability is being treated as a disease for treatment actually came from the UK, then is this also an implantation of the discourse of Tanji that happened in the 1980s?
Yes, I think so. I think the use of Tanji had been used much earlier than the 1980s, but I mean, my research just showed that there was a tipping point from Tanfei to Tanji in the 1980s, so it became much more common. And I think it was always there. The medicalized view of disability and impairment has always been there in China, since the late 19th century. But I think it became much more reinforced with enhanced collaboration between the UK, China and elsewhere in the world, as China wanted to sort of engage with a more scientific approach to society, and technology was coming in. So it was understandable that that was prioritized over changing the language to a more sort of social model, which even in the UK at that time, I think wasn't dominant. I mean, we're still talking about handicapped people in the 1980s. I mean, that was the word that I grew up with rather than disabled people. So you can understand how these things travel internationally, but it doesn't mean to say that the underlying roots of why those things are felt to be appropriate at the time are also there as well. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. So thank you for that question.
My question is, what's your view on the change of our attitudes on mentally disabled people in China and Western country comparatively?
In terms of Bonnie, what's your view on the change of attitudes on mentally disabled people? Okay, so I mean, I think we sort of just covered that, really, haven't we? About the changing attitudes to mental disabled people with mental disabilities and mental illnesses. I think it's, as I said, something that all cultures are struggling with, and I say that because my experiences in the UK working with people with learning impairments suggests that just as much as China, there are even more significant barriers to people who have such impairments or develop impairments through. I work with a lot of people who have cerebral palsy, for example. Although a lot of them manifest as physical impairments, a lot of them have also got learning impairments, and that makes it very interesting. And I can see firsthand the ways in which not only are they excluded from educational opportunities that they could possibly take part in because there aren't the support structures in place, they are discriminated against in terms of employment opportunities, and also in social opportunities. And so, you know, they often find themselves with the friends that they have tend to be people with cerebral palsy or similar learning impairments themselves, because they are marginalized in society. They aren't integrated into society. They are told that these are your friends, these are the people like you. And it's a cycle, I think, and I think that's also what happens. What I see also happening in China too, and so it's not particular to China. This is a global phenomenon, and I think changing attitudes is going to be really hard, in all honesty. But one of the things, this is why I was sort of mentioning the importance of visual communication and visual media and the messages that it sends out. So, for example, in the UK. One of the sort of standout things I think that has happened is that many TV production companies have incorporated people with learning disabilities, mental impairments, and physical impairments in their programming as a matter of norm. So, for example, even children's television is hosted by people with physical and learning impairments. People with Down syndrome, for example, we have a young man who's fantastic. He's the new face of children's television in the UK here. So it's about changing people's understanding of where disabled people fit in society, and I think once people get used to seeing disabled people as not as objects of pity, of objects of sympathy or charity or in need of care, these people are living their full life. They've got a fantastic job, and they're just doing it, you know. So it's about changing, presenting. Let's not say role models. These are not role models, but they are, in a way, people doing jobs, but not doing it because they're disabled or because they have a learning impairment or a physical impairment. That's not why they're there. It's because they can do the job, okay? It's about becoming visible, but visible in ways which doesn't highlight disability. Thinking about who needs to speak on behalf of disabled people. So, for example, it would be almost unacceptable here for somebody without a disability to head up a disabled persons federation or something like that, or be in the responsible positions. It would be, you know, without disabled voices leading and shaping and framing what happens to disabled people. I think it's very difficult to change because, as I said at the end of my talk, people outside the disabled experience can only approximate, they can only guess what it might be like, and they can only guess based on what their understanding of the ideal citizen is. And their ideal citizen is an able-bodied, non-disabled person who's an able-bodied mind, you know, an able-bodied, enabled mind. So they're it's almost impossible for them to put themselves in that situation. They can be allies, and I think that's what a lot of us are trying to be, good allies. But fundamental change needs to be led by, and we need to let disabled people lead. That's how I feel it would happen best.
The question is from Jun Qing Zhu. Disabled children's basic needs can be concluded as social interaction, learning, rehabilitation, and self-expression. This is something that I concluded from international and domestic literature. Do you think this is correct?
Okay, that's really interesting, and so I do work a lot with disabled young people. That's how I do a lot of my research here in the UK, and I suppose I mean it's interesting that we always include sort of the ways in which we prioritize these things, and I think sociability and interaction with broader communities, I think, is extremely important. And I think that's one of the reasons why one of the papers I did was about the development of special education and inclusive education in China. And What we know about special education is that while, for example, it enables young people to get some of the education that they need, what it does is it marginalizes them because they aren't interacting and they don't have the fullness of social participation and interaction with everybody else. They're sort of cornered into meeting with like people, even though a lot of their education then can be tailored and specialized to them. What we know of China, for example, is also that, when you put people in specialist schools, then assumptions about what they should be taught it also takes over. So thinking about, and this happened in the UK as well, so a lot of people who went into specialist education, for example, for people with visual impairments, were told that they couldn't become professors, they couldn't go become anything other than an artist or a blind person's arts or crafts or musicians or something like that. And so they were tailored and focused into particular employments. And I know in China, tuina is obviously an occupation to which people with visual impairments are channeled. So there's a balance to be had, isn't there? Obviously, rehabilitation and health and welfare is important. And again, it's a balance. So I agree there. And self-expression, it goes back to everything that I've been saying, is, what we should try to help young people speak for themselves rather than speak on their behalf, and be able to engage fully in society. Means lots of support might have to go in, but that shouldn't help them define who they are and what they're capable of. That's for them to decide.